Good morning, all. It is such a pleasure, as I mentioned to Kiran and more reluctantly to Wesley. Dominica and Barbados are two of my favorite countries in the Caribbean. I've lived in both, and I really jumped at the chance to share some time with you this morning. I've been given the task of opening, and as true West Indians, we all know what opening means. The Bajans might more see opening as openers, as batting openers, you know, for the Greenwich and the Haynes types. But the Dominicans would be more inclined to think of Grayson Shillingford and Irving Shillingford, Grayson especially as an opening bowler and as the person who opened the way for Dominicans to make the West Indies team. I've been lucky enough to know all of the people that I'm mentioning now in terms of the Dominican cricket analogy. Gregory Shillingford, who became the first Dominican to head WICB, the West Indies Cricket Board of Control, was a batchmate at university. I mean, he was doing his postgrad, I was doing my undergrad, but we were still batchmates. I claim the credit. So that when I get a chance to talk about Dominica and Barbados, I mean, in any context, I jump at it. So welcome, get ready for the opening salvo. I'm hoping to set the tone for this entire webinar series as the unofficial King of Castle Bruce and King of Mile and a Quarter. I want to stake my claim to being a resident of both countries. So I've been asked to talk about climate issues and angles. And I like the cricket analogy because openers had to get the issues and the angles right. You had to pick the line right. You had to pick the line, whether you're a bowler or a batsman, you had to really get the line right. And you had to see those angles. And I've tasked myself with some objectives for this session to explore several climate-related issues that affect all aspects of life in the Caribbean, to illustrate the interconnected nature of the current crises, and to provide a rationale for knowledgeable coverage of these issues. Now, the overarching crisis of this era is really the climate crisis. I don't think it requires much, to-ing and fro-ing for us to get that straight. That these issues and angles through a climate change lens would be what I'm attempting to share. We can view every crisis through this climate change lens. And I want to spend a little time on this. I'm planning to chat with you for a very short time, so you have more time for questions and comments. But I see climate change as the hub from which your stories radiate like spokes to every sector of the economy. And I've told people this for years, it's from A to Z of the economy. So I want to be able to link pre and post-crisis stories. Because if we are going to do a good job of covering these crises, then we really ought to have a sense of what happened before, what happened during, and what are some of the expected consequences post-crisis. Now, when I say from A to Z, I wasn't joking. We won't have time to do all of the possible angles, but I've picked about 12 or 13 from A to Z of economy-wide issues that I think would spark the discussion that I'm hoping we'll have at the end of about 30 minutes or so. And I'm going to take a look at some of these sectors, issues, items of national concern. We're going to look at agriculture, energy, health, infrastructure, recreation and sports, transportation, unionization, voting, and down to zoning. So you see that I've tried to run from A to Z. Of course, we've left out some really spectacular ones, which I hope will come up in the discussion. But using a climate change lens or climate crisis lens, we are going to be inundated with issues surrounding agriculture. In the midst of any kind of crisis, whether it be climate, COVID, volcanic, or man-made crisis, there's a reflex action to speak about local food production. I'm sure most of you would have seen that. The very first hurrah is about what is going to happen to our food production. Changes in climate affect water management, pest outbreaks, heat stress. I mean, a whole range of issues that once you have a climate story, those are the issues and the angles that you should be looking at in terms of what does this have to do with water management? Because invariably, it is going to be about inundation or drought. It's going to be about flooding, excessive damage through copious amounts of water, or drought-related issues. It's going to be about pest outbreaks and the movement of vectors that have been literally blown into your nation. And it's going to be about heat stress, not just for the plants and not just for the animals, it's part of your livestock, but also the farmers, the consumers, the middle people, the hucksters, the higglers, everybody associated with that, with those agricultural value chains, those looped agricultural value chains are going to be impacted. And it's curiously the time when you hear about farmers and fisherfolk being seen as essential workers. I mean, I'm almost always impressed with the ease with which politicians, deem farmers and fisherfolk essential workers in the midst of any kind of crisis, and especially a climate crisis or a COVID crisis. So that climate change lens that you can use to see the importance of all of these climate impacts on a sector like agriculture. Energy, as a major component of the NDCs, and I think we need to spend a little time on this, these nationally determined contributions. The nationally determined contributions are the actual ticket that each member country of CARICOM who has signed on to the Paris Accord is using as their entry card, as their get into the bank card for the GCF, the Green Climate Fund. So that you're encountering a lot of these nationally determined contributions listed by governments as the way in which they are going to reduce their carbon footprint. Although we know, and it's been beaten to death, the fact that we are not the major polluters, each of us as signatories of the Paris Accord, Paris Climate Accord, have to prepare these NDCs, these nationally determined contributions. How are we going to be reducing our carbon footprint? What are we going to be doing in terms of mitigation? And the governments are all hell-bent, as they should be, to develop these NDCs. So there's always an emphasis on renewable energy sources. So any story connected with energy in this era has to do with the renewables: solar, wind, hydro, geothermal. Energy conservation with respect to lighting, air conditioning, and the use of electrical appliances. I mean, you cannot cover these kinds of stories without getting into discussions on solar-powered lighting and the use of, and the lessened use of incandescent type bulbs. The air conditioning changes that are upon us, as you all would have realized. I mean, even in a cool place like Jamaica, even in a cool location like Girodel and things where I spend a lot of time, I mean, the nights are hotter, right? We're experiencing hotter days and hotter nights. And when you think about the increased use of air conditioning and the fact that we're supposed to be conserving energy, especially energy obtained from fossil fuel use, then you see the angles, and so that most of your stories can adapt. The power grid resilience, I mean, we have seen what happens to your power grid any type of climatic event, any type of event associated with the climate crisis, so that all of those stories tend to take that type of bend in terms of increased resilience for the power grid, what kinds of adjustments you're going to be making. Later on, when we get to having a free-flowing conversation, I will mention the type of innovations that you have in communities, let's say like Coverley, where you have climate smart type housing, where most of your utility lines and so are buried, and your street lighting is solar and wind powered, etc. Right? So we'll talk about that. In terms of health, we recently, when I say we, I mean Yale University, Earthmedic, and a number of other agencies recently had a climate change and health webinar series, which I was lucky enough to be a presenter. And what you see coming out of the health sector in terms of climate change impacts and viewing it with a climate change lens is the fact that you need more resilient infrastructure. I mean, the destruction of hospitals and health centers and so after several of these events has led us to believe that, we have to have a more resilient infrastructure, health infrastructure, not just in terms of the actual buildings, but access to those buildings as well. Some of the climate change impacts that have, definite impact on health had to do with vector spread. I'm talking now about vectors of human illnesses now, and not necessarily zoonoses that would be diseases that affect animals and can move on to people. But you're talking about the spread of vectors, and the most common one, of course, now is Aedes aegypti mosquito. The type of injuries that can occur after a climate event, and then the pulmonary issues. I mean, I was really startled by the type of research data that we have access to in this part of the world. There's an observatory in Barbados that has been looking at and analyzing Saharan dust for many years, and they have been able to know the increase in allergic reactions and asthmatic instances, etc. So that those pulmonary issues tend to be at the forefront when you're talking about climate change impacts on health. Infrastructure. I mean, I quickly mentioned, health infrastructure in terms of the actual hospitals and so. But the type of damage to buildings and roads and bridges and power lines, I mean, you can't have a crisis coverage that does not take into account the climate change impacts, the climate crisis impacts on infrastructure. I mean, I remember on one of my last visits to Dominica before 2017, there was actually a bridge, I'm trying to remember where exactly it was, where having anticipated increased riverine flows, they raised the bridge, right? And what was so startling was that we had an event, this was somewhere around 2015, 2016, there was an event, and having cleverly raised the bridge remained intact, but the approaches to the bridge on both sides were washed away because the river didn't just come down higher, it came down wider. And you had both approaches to the bridge being destroyed, and the bridge itself, the area that spanned over what was the original river width, remained intact. So that there's a lot of concern in terms of the type of preparatory warehousing we have, because it's all good and well to see that you have, you have warehousing facilities so that in the event of any climate-related issue, you have a stockpile of food or tarpaulin or whatever. But we have found that in a number of cases, even the warehouses that you have predetermined to be used as warehouses, they are the first to be destroyed. And I mean, we had a very unfortunate case here in Grenada, where I'm currently based, where during Ivan, one of the first buildings to be destroyed was the National Emergency Management Authority building. All right. I'm pleased to report that there's a new NADMA, which is the new name for it now, a new NADMA administration building and facility that is supposed to be a little more climate resilient. So we're expecting that, that would have been a lesson learned from Ivan. Interagency logistics. I mean, I have been in Barbados and Dominica after events, and I can tell you that getting the interagency cooperation right, and getting logistics right is often an issue. No matter how appropriate the plans look on paper beforehand, that interagency collaboration and getting the logistics right in terms of just the deployment of personnel, equipment, tools is often something that as journalists, you have to really get into the pre and current crisis type examinations to be able to make a genuine attempt at reporting on these issues, because those are the issues and the angles that you want to be able to inculcate into your reporting. Recreation and sport. I think it's fairly straightforward in terms of the type of damage that you have to facilities, to your gyms, to your playing fields, your pavilions, your stadia. I mean, I took great pains to make my cricket analogy in the beginning, talking about opening batsmen and opening bowlers and so. But those of us involved in climate change observations, interpretations, mitigation, adaptation, what have you, will know the impact it has had on sport. I mean, I mentioned Gregory Schlingford in my opening salvo as somebody who, was the first Dominican to be head of the West Indies Cricket Board. But Gregory also had a lot of influence in terms of pitch preparation. I mean, those of you who are more cricket savvy will know that if Windward Islands, which Dominica would have been a part, or Barbados was playing Trinidad at Guaracara Park, we obviously had an advantage because we knew about the water table in the Guaracara Park area, so that our captains knew, when to win, when to lose a toss in terms of the characteristics of the playing field of the pitch that would have been determined by the water level, by the tide levels, and so. And with increasing sea levels and all of these issues associated with climate change, you will see that it has an immediate impact on the facilities and on the game itself. The reduced air quality, I spoke about the Sahara, measuring the Sahara dust and so, but with climate change, we have exacerbated some of these conditions. And in terms of recreation and sport, when you think of green spaces and wellness promotion, because as most of you know, the WHO definition of health is not just the absence of disease, but it's a state of general overall wellness. And that type of wellness can only be promoted in, I shouldn't say only, but it's best promoted in, in your green space, your green and blue space. I mean, those of you in Barbados would know that recreation along the south coast and thing, was problematic. Every sargassum season, it was problematic in terms of the water issues, the water and sewage issues in 2018, which, although not directly related to climate change, were impacted by it, and as a matter of fact, was solved based on GCF funding for the Barbados Water Authority, GCF being the Green Climate Fund. So there again, you saw the link between climate change and what would have passed as just arbitrary recreation, as being able to walk through that area there in Worthing. Transportation. We have all heard about the need to have more mass transit solutions, the fact that we can't be having all these fossil fuels spewing greenhouse gas spewing, vehicles on the roads in small countries like ours. Barbados has made some more determined steps in terms of the use of electric vehicles and so on, having charging stations. And so I was lucky enough to be a judge on a regional entrepreneurial program. And I know that there's a Dominican with a proposal to do electric buses, to do an electric bus service actually to handle the Melville Hall, especially Melville Hall to Roseau Run. So in terms of road taxes and vehicle import specifications, I mean, the climate crisis has been behind that as well. You now have governments putting punitive measures in place to ensure that we do not import through these foreign used and roll-on, roll-off type arrangements, that we do not import into the country vehicles that are no longer serviceable for use in the metropolitan countries. So that is another direct impact on how they are attempting to control their nationally determined contributions in terms of the number of vehicles on the road spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now this might be a new one to some of you in terms of issues and angles. But what has been the impact of climate change or the climate crisis on unionization, on trade unions? We've all heard about all of this talk about the greening of industry and so, but how has that impacted unions? And I've been lucky enough to do some work with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and the Cipriani College of Labour and Cooperative Studies in Trinidad to look at the impact of the greening of industry, the greening of jobs, the need for retraining and retooling of workers. I mean, I'm not sure how many journalists have to, spend the time at looking at the impact of the climate crisis on retraining and retooling of workers. Some of the blue and green economy considerations. I mean, we as a collective as a region, as small island developing states, have been literally killing out ourselves fighting over the green economy. When we have an exclusive economic zone that far exceeds the land area that we're so busy trying to build an economy on. So that the blue economy has become a major area of interest. And who are going to be the workers, who are going to be the people managing those resources? What role have the unions played in retraining, reassessing, reorganizing some of the occupational health and safety issues that are going to come into the fore? I mean, we know it's hotter, we know it's drier, we know that there are increased risk, especially for outdoor workers. I know that the ILO had a special section on that in terms of how our union preparing their workers, especially workers who have to work outdoors and so on. And there have been assessments made in the Caribbean about the impact on workers, especially outdoor workers, whether they be in construction, agriculture, etc. So that unionization angle is an issue and an angle that that might be worthy of some consideration. We dealt with unionization, voting. I'm coming down TUV. How many of us have really looked critically at the impact of the climate crisis on voting? Have we seen that angle? I mean, all you have to do is ask my good friend Pancho, Andrew De Carries out there in St. Lucia, who just launched a Green Party. That do people really vote based on their interpretation of what this climate crisis is about? How many punitive taxes are there out there that provide disincentives for scarce resource wastage, like water? Water bills going up, and so has that affected election outcomes in countries that you are familiar with, right? Look at the energy, cost of energy, cost of water. What about the government's role or your party's role or the party that you're prepared to vote for, their role in environmental protection and stewardship? I mean, how many of the supporters of particular parties will leave that party or stop supporting that party or vote differently if mangrove protection becomes an issue? Only if mangrove protection becomes an issue as it impacts fish catch and the livelihoods of fishermen and the type of protection that mangroves give to storm surges, etc. So unless those dots are connected, how has the climate crisis affected voting? How have these parties and governments handled crisis management? What have they done since the official declaration, if you like, of the climate crisis? How have they been able to mobilize climate funds? And I think this is a very important one. In terms of issues and angles, I think as journalists, we have to take a lot of time to see just how some of these climate funds have been used in terms of infrastructure development. I mean, I'm not going to be into name calling and so, but we've heard that there are going to be climate smart cities, that the infrastructure is going to be climate smart and climate resilient, and great sums of money have been spent on the planning and in some cases the initial implementation of these ideas or projects. So voting, I think, would have been impacted significantly by the climate crisis. Zoning, so another one that doesn't always make the headlines. But how many of the governments, how many of these countries have been impacted by zoning? I mean, when I use my cricket analogy, I mean, I think I mentioned Adam Sanford as the first Kalinago descendant to play for the West Indies. I mean, how are we dealing with the zoning of land spaces in the various countries? What has been done in Barbados, let's say, with gully protection? I'm currently working on a national invasive species plan for Barbados, and I can tell you that gully protection and so is a major issue in terms of how do you zone areas of your country, whether for watershed purposes, for mandatory setbacks. How do you tell major developers who are coming to provide jobs, as the politicians often say, provide jobs to hotels and so? How do you ensure that you have mandatory setbacks in the midst of ongoing sea level rise, right? Measurable sea level rise, right? For the Bajans, I mean, you look at Accra Beach. You know, I'm old enough to know what Accra Beach looked like, a couple of decades ago, right? In terms of land use planning, why are so many of these governments unwilling to have a really significant national land use plan? Why are they always so anxious to shift areas that were once agricultural, if you like, and now have them into housing and domestic use? How does this zoning affect your other issues? I mean, issues that seem unrelated. I mean, as part of my work with invasive species and so in Barbados, I can tell you that, that monkey issue, that green monkey issue is going to be extremely significant because I have been lucky enough or old enough to have seen the progression of the monkey issue in St. Kitts, where by moving the habitable areas, if you like, moving into Phillips level, moving into Ortiz level, and so in St. Kitts, you found the monkey population in closer proximity now to inhabited areas. residential areas, if you like, right? How are these governments, these political parties handling zoning? What is going to be the impact on the Kalinago territory, let's say, as we see the advances of the climate crisis? What is that going to mean in terms of watershed protection in Dominica generally, and floodplains support in other countries? So that was just a quick run through, as I said, just a conversation starter of the A to Z of these climate impacts, because what I really want us to do is take a look at covering these crises. So by definition, a crisis is time-bound, all right? So we often have to get the pre-crisis analysis right. And that's why I was asking you to take a look at some of these issues and angles, so that by the time you start covering the actual crisis, you would have had an idea of some of the issues and angles that would be impacting it. And then I really want us to spend at least a minute on the difference between recording and reporting, as seen as the difference between information and knowledge. And I know I heard our first presenter from Internews talk about this information and the sharing of information. But I want to posit that information is not enough. Information never solved a problem yet, right? Informed people solve problems. People with the knowledge solve problems. And the thing about information is that it is very easy to transfer information. I could have sent you guys this PowerPoint, as distressing as it is, a couple of weeks ago. You would have had all the information then. But if you want to make that transformation to knowledge along that Decow continuum that I like to refer to all the time, that continuum that goes from data to information to knowledge to understanding to wisdom. And if you want to make that jump, that is where human beings come in. And since your audience is comprised only of humans, then if you really want to have knowledgeable people out there in the community, then you have to make sure that that information is interrogated and becomes part of their own knowledge portfolios. So that the mere handing of a brochure, and I use this example a lot when I'm talking to people in strictly agricultural spheres. I remember as a field diagnostician, going to a farmer's field in Trinidad, getting into his vehicle, driving up to his farm, and between us, in the front of the Land Rover, were a stack of pamphlets. And one of those pamphlets had the exact disease that I was going to look at. So this man had all the information all the time, but still didn't have a clue what was going on in his farm. So when I got up there and we took a look around and walked around and so on, I explained it so. But he had all that information right there on a pamphlet. So handing somebody a pamphlet or just putting out a report is not enough. It's not enough. To make that change from information to knowledge, you need to know not just the what, the when and the where, but the how and the why. And this is what I'm hoping that we can discuss in the remaining time that I have for us to look at some of these climate issues and angles. Thank you very much. I think I still have some time so we can really get into the nitty-gritty of what I wanted to do today, which is to share some thoughts with you and to get some feedback from you on what do you think of some of these issues that I mentioned, A to Z, that can impact your coverage of a climate-related crisis. Bearing in mind that none of these crises are sequential. You have easily seen, the Bajans would have seen how you can have a COVID crisis overtaken or overlapped by a volcanic ash crisis that is right smack in the middle of an ongoing climate crisis. So these are not issues that we are going to be looking at in sequence. It's not as if you're going to have enough time to say, okay, I'm finished reporting on a climate issue now. I'm going to talk about a volcanic issue next. And then I'm going to talk about, some other kind of hazard, right? And I want to compliment everyone who spoke before. Nobody mentioned anything about natural disaster, because that's one of the few things that really irks me. I don't believe that they are natural disasters. They are natural hazards that can become disasters, especially when you meet unprepared, uninformed, or complacent, as the survey results showed. Because the same 7.0 earthquake on the Richter scale that hits one country, hits another country, and it becomes a disaster in one country and may not be a disaster in the other. In the same way as a category 5 hurricane. I see we have some hands raised, so that means I've not put everybody to sleep. There's at least somebody asking me to beg me to stop or to ask a question. Emmanuel, please.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. These are very, very critical issues, but I find that in many cases, when we are talking about climate change, we are, as journalists ourselves, need to be more enlightened. And as journalists, we like, generally speaking, sexy issues. And when you hear climate change, when I first heard of climate change, it's nothing. It didn't bother me. It wasn't something that I was attracted to because it seems so abstract. So my problem is that when we having these presentations, it would be better if you can break it down. How does climate change affect the average person? Because when the average person hears about climate change, they brush it off. How does it impact the price of the food in the supermarket, right? So we need to explain to the average person what things like carbon footprint and these kind of things mean, how that affects me. So that is my observation, that, you can tell me how it's going to affect me in my everyday living so that I can actually relate to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Point taken. And if I'm given leeway by the organizers, Kiran and Lesser Wesley, then let me just take a little time to deal with that. In terms of how the everyday citizen is impacted, as I said, because we do not frame it in those very, very, very strict climate crisis terms. The price of food right now in Barbados, which affects everybody across the board, is as a result of two major overlays: climate crisis and COVID. In terms of the productivity of your farms, either because of water management issues, which is something I mentioned on the agriculture slide, or heat stress issues, or the fact that the inputs, the traditional inputs that you will be depending on from imports that have been restricted because of COVID, not just because of the financial restrictions to import it, but because things are just moving a lot slower, right? You cannot import, stuff as conveniently or as cheaply as before, right? Inputs coming out of China, which we may not think of China when you think of food, but in terms of inputs that are necessary, then freight costs have gone up threefold, and this is no exaggeration. I am telling you from actual experience. Container shipments out of China have gone up threefold. So that there's going to be a very direct impact to the man in the street. The price of fish, right? Nobody says it outright that, okay, the price of fish is this because of coral bleaching, because the mangroves have been destroyed, because the fish spawning grounds have been destroyed, because the farmers have to go, the fishers have to go further for a similar catch. And if they're going to spend all that money in fuel and everything else and ice, then when it comes back to the landing site, it is going to be more expensive. But I mean, people don't go around saying, okay, I'm raising the price of my fish because of climate change. You know, you get some other euphemism for it, you know. Either fishers they have to go further now, but nobody spends the time saying, you know, why do you have to go further now? Why are fuel costs going up? I mean, there's been a major controversy here in Grenada where I'm based in terms of fuel prices. Fuel prices took us a significant hike, right, over the last couple of months, right? So in terms of bringing it to the man in the street, as I said, we are all culpable, if you like. I mean, we as the scientists have not been going about the place because we are often seen as alarmists if we get too involved. Because as you know, if the only tool on your tool belt is a hammer, everything is going to start looking like a nail. So those of us in the climate sector have to be very careful that we don't go about, you know, as I said, being alarmists, but there has to be a way to bring the points home. Kiran, Wesley, have I been rambling on? I mean, I'm sensitive to the fact that you guys are controlling the timer, so please give me a...
No. I think, Steve, that is a very, very valid point. I mean, at the end of the day, which we have said before, and I think we've constantly said this, is that, you know, the stories are about the people. So, you know, Emmanuel's perspective on how does it affect the individual, I think that is a basic question every journalist has to ask going into this story. And we are going to talk more about how we do that in one of the other sessions. And I think that session is actually next week, you know, how we address it. But as journalists today, we have to keep reading. You know, we have to read, we have to ask the experts like yourself or other experts we know, you know, how do you bring this home? And I think that is one of the things that's easy for us to miss sometimes, because with stories like this, it takes a lot of time and effort. And I know how busy it is in a newsroom when you have deadlines and so on. But you need to start, you know, retraining your mind and carve out that space to ask those questions. Wesley?
Yeah, my view on this is that I think that we do cover the climate crisis every single day. And our newspapers and broadcasts are packed with climate crisis stories. The issue here is perhaps with the framing and providing the perspective that links what's happening to the climate crisis. But I am absolutely sure about that we do cover the climate crisis. Virtually every single story in the first few pages of the newspaper have a bearing on the climate crisis that have not been framed in that kind of way. So I don't deliver too much licks on journalists for not presenting the perspective of the climate crisis. What might be a shortcoming is a fuller understanding of the dynamics of the crisis, such that when the stories are being framed, people don't go away with the feeling that the flooding story they covered today did not have to do with changes in rainfall patterns, unplanned developments, and all the other things that contribute to making climate change move from being a hazard to being a potential disaster.
Yeah. I mean, what I've tried, as I said, to show, you know, from A to Z, every story that you're going to be covering out there, where it has to do with the importation of vehicles, it has to do with the new design for hospitals, there's a climate change issue and angle to it, right? Which is what I've tried to show you in terms of from A to Z, any aspect of life in these here SIDS. I mean, I want to vent here and put my head on a block and see that, you know, there are very few issues that you can come up with that will not have, you know, some underlying climate issue or angle, which is what I was asked to present on, you know, which I've tried, and as I said, between A to Z, you know, and all points in between, right? We left out finance. I mean, look at, without drawing a direct reference to Dominica, how many of you remembered when the World Bank funding was announced, that the two most important ministries became housing and agriculture in Dominica? The Prime Minister took housing and the Deputy Prime Minister took agriculture. And those, I mean, you can't get bigger stories than that as far as I'm concerned. I was with the FAO at the time, I know it struck me that, here is this quick admission that, that these are the two most important sectors. All of a sudden, I mean, at least from the point of view of having to disburse, dispense, or spend, significant sums of money, right? As a post-crisis eventuality. Yeah, Wesley?
No, thank you for that. I think Kiran.
Questions? Any other questions? Or have I put so many people to sleep that none of them have?
Well, actually, I wanted, not at all, Steve. I mean, I feel like I had the third cup of coffee for the morning, so that's good news. We have Jim is putting up his hand. Jim?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a very specific question. I found your presentation to be one that in a time of crisis, I mean, this is a real toolkit for journalists to look at the possible stories that they can cover. But I'm really interested in a specific point that I think that you might be able to answer better than anyone else here, and that is how prepared is, say, Barbados to deal with an emergency situation where, due to climate change, flooding, hurricane, whatever, you lose electricity and you lose internet. You still have a need to get the information out, but are these countries prepared, Dominica included, prepared to help journalists get the message out from the government sources?
Oh, when you say prepared to help journalists, I know that I can speak with a fair amount of authority for the country where I'm currently a resident, right? And I know that NADMA, which is the National Disaster Management Agency or something like that, that's what the acronym means. They have embedded, I mean, to use a CNN term, but I couldn't talk to you without mentioning CNN. This has been a pet thing of mine, so that you have embedded journalists within that. So one would assume, let me be very careful here, one would assume that in terms of emergency information and responses, and so that at least you would have a representative of the local journalistic community embedded, literally embedded in NADMA. So I see that as a mechanism by which it can be done. Barbados is a lot better served, I would think, without casting aspersions on what happens in Dominica, because CDIMA which is the Regional Disaster Management Agency, is located in Barbados, right? And I know I have journalist friends who I know have direct lines, if you like, of communication with CDIMA and with CIMH, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, which are the kinds of agencies where I have, really, really specific data for communicating to people pre-hazard and post-hazard, right? In terms of the actual mechanics of how this is done, Jim, I'm not in a position to really say. Maybe Wesley might be a better place to
I actually have a slide on this particular issue because
great.
Back in 2018, when the ACM got together to talk about covering disasters, one of the things we invited CDIMA, and one of the things we agreed to was that the protocols should include recognition of journalists as being among the first responders in the event of anything happening. I was hoping that we might have seen some of the CDIMA people here today to issue a reminder, because that has gone through it has fallen through the spaces that time generates. But I do have something to talk about. And so, Jim, yes, I will address that during my presentation.
Okay, great. Nazim?
I'd like, yes, Steve, I just wanted to introduce Nazim. For the folks who don't know, she's the president of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers and of the Guyana Press Association, and a board member at MIC. Good morning, Nazima.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiran. I'm home today. It is Human Navi. I didn't realize it was a holiday until yesterday. So if you hear any noise in the background, it's just rain playing. Steve, I just wanted to make...
Wait, stop. Most people in the middle of a climate change discussion, if they hear it's rain outside, they're going to think it's rainfall. It's her sun rain she's referring to.
It's my son.
Go ahead,
Steve, I
Nazim.
just wanted to make a point. Only recently, I had to talk to a group of journalists about why the floods that happened in Guyana, the disaster, the effects, we still need to cover what has been happening because there's been food shortages, which is affecting prices on the market, and so many different things. Rice has been affected, sugar has been affected, the exports, tracking what's going on with the exports, and also tracking what destruction has come to regions that, you know, were not traditionally flooded. As you would know, all the regions in Guyana were flooded for the first time in recent history.
Yeah.
We've never seen a disaster like this in recent history. The 2005 floods touched the coast and some other areas, but you had places that we thought, you know, were high in Guyana that was underwater for about 2 to 3 weeks. Farmlands destroyed, and you know, I was telling them it's not a one-off event. You know, there's so many things that we need to follow through, because even covering the market story is you know, very important, because you're able to track prices. And I know Emmanuel spoke about, you know, people's pockets and so on. People like to know what is going on with prices and when, you know, their pockets are affected. We need to tie those things to the climate crisis and what's happening. Interestingly, I have been reviewing some of the articles on MIC, and I know you, Steve, you've always emphasized nutrition security. It's not something we need to put on the back burner. And, you know, I know there's a call for journalists to prioritize health and prioritize COVID and prioritize, you know, other stuff, but we need to at least fit this in our agenda, because we are heading down a really interesting road that is really scary. Steve, thank you for your presentation, and please share it with us.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
sure. Yeah, it's going to be available. The PowerPoint is, you know, is freely available, and those of you who want, you know, get permission for the recording, you know, if you can tolerate my voice for so long. But even more importantly, Nazima, as I said, I wanted to be sure that I didn't skew this presentation into, you know, the centrality of agriculture, or the centrality of food security, or more appropriately, nutrition security. But a number of the issues in terms of the price of food and what passes for food is the fact that, you know, some of the more, let me phrase my words carefully, some of the more nutritionally sound food items are under pressure due to the climate crisis. So that we're finding ourselves now, not just in terms of imports, but in terms of the varieties or the ways in which we are preparing some of these food items, changing the nutritional value. Let me just give you a quick for instance. We now know that plants grown in soil, have are exposed to particular bacteria, which we refer to as the soil microbiome. And that has an impact in terms of the nutritional content of those plants. When we shift towards more hydroponically grown plants grown in vertical apparati, as is being promoted now as a climate change adaptation, we are finding that those plants that we're using for food are less nutritious than the field grown, if you like, the field grown plants. So I'm saying that just in terms of the quality of the material, not just the price, but the quality of the food items, of the plants and animals, even, you know, there is going to be a disparity, and it is all going to be linked back to climate change and the climate crisis. But as I said, I didn't want this thing to degenerate into a climate change lecture. I wanted it to be, you know, specifically looking at the issues and the angles. And I think that I want to put my head on a block and say that unionization and zoning and voting thing, you know, angles, you know, would be angles that are not covered every day in the press. I think I could I can say that with a fair amount of certainty. Yeah? Any other questions, comments? Because that timer you heard just now was my 50-minute timer. So
I've put in the chat box a link to the ACM's Climate Crisis Handbook for Caribbean journalists, which Steve was a lead member of in terms of the development of that handbook.
yeah.
So it's, I think that in the Caribbean, we have been looking at climate change as a substantive issue all on its own, but I still hold to the view that in any event, our regular coverage does include a perspective on the climate crisis, but it is not always presented in that way. So you don't need to say, okay, here's a climate crisis story.
Right. Wesley, could you just permit me 1 minute to share our favorite story? I mean, it's one of the few things I have in common with Wesley. To admit that publicly is a burdensome. But anyhow, we were recently, as a team, God forbid, in another webinar series. And what was so startling was the climate change and COVID interaction to frame national security issues, which is something that happened in the A to Z. I didn't have national or didn't have security. But here you had communities in Jamaica that were under lockdown. Barrack communities where the housing, it's housing, it's cramped housing. There's no front yard or backyard. And you're asking these people to stay indoors for most of the day, especially when it's extremely hot. So you had breaches of national security regulations. People were breaking the law because of how hot it is now. Not only that, and because of the water crisis generally, which is triggered again by climate change, these same people had to walk 2 or 3 blocks to the nearest standpipe, which is the common pipe for somebody non-Caribbean, the non-Caribbean people on this webinar, right? So here you have a climate crisis triggered national security issue that happened in the midst of COVID. So you had COVID lockdown, COVID, and an accompanying story, this preoccupation the health people have with washing your hands. There are some people who, they hear that and that passes over their head, because if I have to walk so many miles for water, I ain't gonna be using that same water to be washing my hand every 2 minutes. So, so we're gonna have to find something else. And clearly I can't afford hand sanitizers. So this COVID crisis is going to have to be subsumed by a more involved climate crisis. Ladies, gents, my Barbadian and Dominican colleagues, as I say, as the king of Castle Bruce and mile and a quarter and Cooverley, I hand you over to the more capable hands of Kiran and Wesley. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Steve. Well, just before I bring you on, I just wanted to get a feel, from everyone here, because as I said, guys, this is your forum. This is where we really do learn a lot more when we have the exchange of ideas and comments from each other. What have been some of the challenges for you all in doing some of these stories? Can anybody say, what has been challenging for them? Anybody?
Hello, good morning.
Morning, Carol. Hi.
That was such an interesting presentation. It really caused me to think a lot. Normally, when you're covering news for radio, a lot of it can be very hard news. So you would get, especially with topics like climate change, you'll basically get what ministers are doing, what the prime minister is saying, and where she's at, and this conference and the next. But also coming from an on-air background where it was a lot of human interaction, this really caused me to think about how we can do this a little better, or how I can do this a little better, because if it seems so far-fetched and so far removed from the average person, is the message really getting across? So I want to say Thank you for that brilliant presentation. I've been scribbling and thinking of angles that I can go from. For mainstream news, you have probably clips of 30 seconds and a little lead in, but this is something that I would probably think would be best served where features are concerned, to see how you can link what seems far removed to the average person and bring it all together so that it actually makes sense. So thank you very much for that. So not so much a question, but a comment.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Carol. Anybody else before we move over to Wesley?
Yeah, I would like to agree with Carol, and I'd like to thank Mr. Steve Maximay, I hope I pronounced that properly, for that.
Pronounce it properly.
Yeah, for that presentation. Like Carol, this has, I think even from today, it will allow me to approach my leads, with that angle on climate change, and to really bridge the gap between, like Carol said, issues or topics that would normally be so far removed mentally from the common man or the man on the street, and show them how these things affect our pricing at the market, or even issues in relation to national security, like you mentioned, people breaching, in order to get some convenience from the issues posed by climate change. So it's very interesting, and your A to Z, should I say theory or concept is I think very, very eye-opening. It's a brilliant way of putting it, and really showing the angles in which we can approach this as journalists. So thank you again, Steve. You just helped me out there a bit. So
No. One of the things I want to mention to my Dominican colleagues, I lost a very good friend a couple of years ago, Ricky Art. For those of you who know Ricky Artport, Ricky used to be Chief Agriculture Officer in Dominica, and he died of leptospirosis. And I've been preaching here in Grenada concerns about our shift, our climate crisis enabled shift towards less agrochemicals and more composting and all of these nice sounding agricultural efforts. Because in the transfer of information without that knowledge gap, without that knowledge jump, we have found that people are referring to any pile of rubbish in their backyard as compost. And if you make the mistake of putting meat scraps also in those bundles of rubbish in your backyard that you're calling compost, then you already have a rat apartment. And it's out of that type of arrangement that you have the increases in leptospirosis in the region. I mean, and these are really interesting, interesting from the point of view of, if you do not connect the dots, then you miss some of the reasons why there's been this increased emphasis on compost. And if it's not done properly, then you can really have a rat apartment. It could lead on to leptospirosis and a whole lot of other unintended consequences. Sorry to take up out of Wesley's time.
No, that's okay.